The subject given to me is rather vast in some of vitreoretinal surgery, indications, techniques, complications, etc., etc. So I thought instead of trying to cover a whole gamut of subject which requires several days to cover and confusing you at the end of the day, which are actually required for a vitreoretinal fellow, not for a postgraduate, I will restrict it to what probably you are required to know from the point of view of indications, what do you expect if you send a patient for a vitreoretinal surgery, etc., etc. So to deal with that, let us start with absolute basics first. What are the layers of the retina? Okay, it may sound stupid, but I think it is rather important that we know what part of the retinal layer is facing the vitreous and what is facing the retinal pigment epithelium and what is in between, what is between this layer. These would be important for us to understand certain aspects of vitreoretinal disorders themselves, not necessarily surgical disorders. So just to quickly go over them, for want of time, I don't think I'll be able to ask individuals to give the answers. You have the pigment epithelium, which is right at the bottom. Then you have the photoreceptors or rods and cones, the nuclei of the photoreceptors, the layer of which is the communication between the outer nuclear layer, nucleus of rods and cones with the bipolar cells, that is the outer plexiform layer. The inner nuclear layer contains the nuclei of all other cells, including horizontal cells, bipolar cells, Mueller cells, etc. Then you have the axons of these communicating with the dendrites of the ganglion cells here. In the plexiform layer, the ganglion cell layer, whose axons form the optic nerve. And it's so beautifully seen in the OCT here. What I would like to only emphasize is on one point, that is this last hyperreflective layer was not interpreted properly till we have the spectral domain OCT or even the swept source OCT. Now we realize that there are multiple layers in these rather than just one hyperreflective layer. We used to call it as retinal pigment epithelium. So maybe I'll just spend a word on that. The others are all self-explanatory, which we talked about. But this outer plexiform layer, in general, please understand that plexiform layers give you hyperreflective shadow and nuclear layers give you hyporeflective shadow. The outer plexiform layer is further divided into the dendritic, which is coming from the nuclei of the bipolar cells, while the axonal, which are coming from the nuclei of the rods and cones. Okay, the axonal layer is very, very hyporeflective, and that near the fovea forms a major part of the thickness of the retina, and that's what is called Henle's layer. Okay, that's where you get the most of the fluid collecting in the cystoid macular edema. All right. Now, beyond that is the external limiting membrane, which is hyperreflective, and then you have the rods and cones layer, which is further divided into the myoid zone and the ellipsoid zone. The ellipsoid zone is what was previously called as the ISOS junction. It's actually not ISOS junction, that is the ellipsoid zone, which is the hyperreflective zone. Beyond that is the interdigitation between the photoreceptors and the RPE, and then of course the RPE-Bruch's complex. Okay, so remember there are actually 4 subdivisions of this hyperreflective layer. If you see the old OCTs, there is the external limiting membrane, the myoid zone, which is hyperreflective, the ellipsoid zone, which is hyperreflective, then the RPE-Bruch's membrane complex. So next point is, we should know as a vitreoretinal person is, what are the areas of strongest vitreoretinal attachments? Can somebody answer the question? What are the areas of strongest vitreoretinal attachments? Well, vitreous base is the first, because it's the strongest attachment where you cannot really physically remove the vitreous from, even during surgery. You tend to debulk the vitreous but don't remove it. Yes, accidentally it can happen with a blunt trauma, vitreous can get dialyzed, which can get avulsed. But deliberately when you want to remove the vitreous from the vitreous base, it's almost never possible, except when you excise the retina with it. So it's a circumferential zone which straddles the ora serrata. So it extends on the pars plana epithelium as well as onto the ora serrata. This is very important to remember, because there are cases where the pars plana epithelium can be detached in a case of retinal detachment, and you can actually have holes in the pars plana area rather than in the retina, which can be missed. Only in a thorough examination during surgery can detect these breaks in the pars plana epithelium, and because of the continuity of the sub-PPE area with subretinal space, you get a clinical retinal detachment, but the break is somewhere else. You can have an attachment at the optic disc which is relatively strong but not very strong. You can detach it. In fact, that's perhaps the first areas where spontaneous PVD starts occurring. That's where you get the Weiss ring. At the macula, again plus minus, not a very strong attachment, but you can have problems of what they call as anomalous PVD. Anomalous PVD is where the vitreous doesn't detach cleanly from the retina, but tends to leave behind areas of undetached hyaloid, which proliferate and cause a parietal membrane, etc., etc. And it can also be attached firmly around the major blood vessels, where so much so the collagen loops around the vessel and comes back. So when the vitreous detaches, you can actually tear the major vessels and cause vitreous hemorrhage. Okay, so this is the importance of the vitreoretinal attachments. So what are the changes due to high myopia that are relevant to surgical anatomy? Because we know that high myopes are prone to get detachments, and also there are certain problems that you have during surgery. So let us try to understand what happens in high myopia that predispose them to retinal detachment. One is increased AP diameter, which is more in the retroequatorial portion than the entire globe, contrary to a ophthalmic eye. So, in effect, the sclera becomes thin, the choroid becomes thin, as well as the retina becomes thin. And because of these reasons, the sclera can bulge at various locations, peripapillary, posterior pole, equatorial, etc., causing various kinds of staphylometra. When you pass sutures in these thin scleras, there is always a risk there can be accidental globe perforation. When the retina is thin, obviously it can give way. It can give way in the form of retinal breaks, which are more easily formed in a thin retina compared to a thick retina. There is also increased incidence of lattice degenerations, which also increases the risk of retinal detachments. Again, abnormal vitreoretinal adhesions are more common in high myopia than a normal or emmetropic eye. Something similar to what you see in so-called vitreoretinal syndromes. So there will be anomalous vitreoretinal attachment, so that the vitreous base can be quite posterior in a high myopic eye and not as anterior as you see in a emmetropic eye. There is also increased risk of choroidal hemorrhage because of relatively unsupported large choroidal vasculature. It can bleed very easily during surgery, especially with the sudden hypotony. Right? These are the specific features which set apart a highly myopic eye from a emmetropic eye. Next important question which is asked in the examination is, how do you differentiate between a rhegmatogenous retinal detachment, a tractional detachment, and a secondary detachment clinically? Okay? So this table summarizes to you the various features which help you to identify what is what. In very often it may be very obvious because of the nature of the condition with which the patient presents, like a diabetes mellitus, an obvious tumor in the eye. But there are always situations where there can be a cause for confusion. Then you rely upon certain subtle features. If you see in rhegmatogenous detachment, the surface is convex. It's got a corrugated surface, not a very smooth surface, because of a retinal edema that almost always encompasses a fresh detachment of retina. It is the retinal edema which retina makes it slightly corrugated in its appearance, undulated in appearance. So that, along with the convex surface and the presence of retinal break, tells you it is a rhegmatogenous retinal detachment. But a retinal break need not always be visible. Obviously it is there, but it is not always obvious. That is when there is confusion between exudative detachment and a rhegmatogenous detachment. Then you see other features, like does it shift with posture? Shifting with posture is more in favor of an exudative detachment compared to a rhegmatogenous detachment. Although, again, there are caveats, there are always exceptions to rule. That is, there are conditions like a very, very chronic detachments of retina, due to retinal break, mind you, where the retina becomes so thin and atrophic that fluid can sometimes shift. And as I said, the retina has fine undulations only in a relatively fresh detachment. While a chronic detachment, the retina can become thin and transparent again, not opaque or opalescent like a fresh detachment. It doesn't have the undulations, fine undulations. It can be absolutely smooth, bullous appearance. And there is no tractional force visible except when you have, of course, superadded proliferative vitreoretinopathy. In a tractional detachment, the surface is usually concave unless it is complicated by a retinal break, when you call it as a combined tractional rhegmatogenous element. And it's very slowly progressive. Pure TRD progresses very slowly. Studies have shown that it may take even 1 year for it to reach the macula, even if it is just near the arcade. And usually the surface is very smooth. And tractional force is demonstrable. You can see the pre-retinal fibrosis which is pulling the retina. An exudative RD again has a convex surface similar to a rhegmatogenous detachment. As I said, shifting fluid could be very important. And when you make the patient sit up and do the ophthalmoscopy, you can actually sometimes see what was hidden by the bullous detachment, something like a choroidal hemangioma. If hemangioma is a relatively flat lesion, unlike a melanoma, for example, hence it can be easily camouflaged by a highly elevated detachment. So you change the posture, it may well be obvious. The cause, as I said, may be identifiable as a tumor or inflammation. Another important area where you must be very conscious of the fact that there could be hidden tumor is secondaries. Secondaries can be multiple and they can be quite small but result in a massive detachments. Similarly, a choroidal hemangioma, especially of a Sturge-Weber syndrome, can result in massive detachments where the retina can actually touch the posterior lens surface. So if you have a fresh detachment of retina presenting to you in the clinic, what are the options that you have for management? Can you tell me? What are the options you have for a simple detachment of retina presenting to you with a single break, say at 12 o'clock meridian? Okay, scleral buckle. Pneumatic retinopexy. Or a pars plana vitrectomy. You've got three options easily, is it not? So let us discuss about these very quickly. Scleral buckling, pneumatic retinopexy, and pars plana vitreoretinal surgery. The problem with saying what should be done and what should not be done is depends upon your own choice. And there are situations where you may do scleral buckling, I may do pars plana vitrectomy, a third person may do pneumatic retinopexy, depending upon your own experience, your own training, as well as your own school of thought. Okay? There are other reasons why you may switch from one to another depending upon individual patient's scenario. But in general, if the same case can be managed by all three, you choose one, I choose another, none of us is wrong. But it's just that we are talking about options. Okay? So if you want to talk of options, at least we should know what could be relative indications versus contraindications. So what are the basic principles first of the scleral buckling procedure? This is again a commonly asked examination question. The basic principle is you indent the eye wall at the site of the retinal break using some exoplantic material against the retina, detached retina, retinal break. So you are actually indenting it into the vitreous cavity which is filled with gel vitreous. So the retina is being sandwiched between the gel vitreous and the indentation caused by your buckle. Then you try to create a chorioretinal adhesion around the retinal break so that you can seal off the break from the convection currents in the liquid vitreous. It is the convection currents which make the edges get lifted up and allow the fluid to enter the subretinal space. So that you are cutting off by creating chorioretinal adhesion. And you may or may not drain the subretinal fluid to facilitate a quick approximation of the retina to the retinal pigment epithelium. These are the basic three concepts of scleral buckling. Now, when can pneumatic retinopexy be performed? It's not that every case you can do both scleral buckling and pneumatic retinopexy, but there are a bunch of cases where you can do both. Let's talk about when you can do pneumatic. Obviously, you are relying upon the buoyancy of the gas to tampen out the retinal break. Buoyancy is called flotational force. And the second concept is surface tension. These are the two properties of gas which we are utilizing in pneumatic retinopexy. So the flotation is obviously maximal in the upper half, not in the lower half. And hence you choose a break between 4 to 8 o'clock where you can position his or her head so that the gas can tampen out the break. You must be sure that there is no other break in the other quadrants. Otherwise, there will be a failure of surgery. And this can happen if there is a little bit of vitreous hemorrhage, a little bit of cataract, pupil not dilating properly, lot of after cataract. So if your visibility of the rest of the retina is not good and you're not indented and made sure that there is no other break, you should never attempt pneumatic retinopexy. And in fact, that is the cause for the failure, which is why people have drifted away from pneumatic retinopexy. Not because it's a bad technique, it's because it's bad indications which spur you to go away from the pneumatic retinopexy. And the retinal break should not be very large, so much so that the gas may not be able to tampen out it, number one. Number two, the gas can go into subretinal space easily before it expands. Okay? A small bubble, or when it becomes small bubbles, it can go into subretinal space if the break is very large. and it expands in the subretinal space rather than in the vitreous cavity. There should be no PVR, no glaucoma, because the gas expands and can compromise the optic disc perfusion if the aqueous outflow is not good. And the extent of detachment is not a criteria. It can be a small detachment, a total detachment, doesn't matter. You can still do pneumatic retinopexy. What is meant by steamroller technique? Anybody? Only one person is answering. I'm sure others also know. What is steamroller technique? Well, you use it when the macula is not detached and you're worried that your gas will push the fluid into submacular space and detach a macula which is previously attached. You would not like to, is it not? Although it may reattach in the next 24 hours time, but you would not like to detach a macula which is not detached. So, to prevent that, when you do pneumatic retinopexy, use a steamroller technique. You inject the gas and immediately position them prone. So the gas ascends in front of the optic disc. So there is no chance for the fluid to push into submacular space. And then in a graded fashion, you shift the head so that the fluid gets pushed out of the retinal break and retina gets actually reattached in the process. And as there is no fluid in the subretinal space, at least not enough fluid to detach the macula. That is steamroller technique. It takes a little time. You have to be with the patient and patiently shift the head in the direction of the break. Okay, let us switch gears. I am going in a potpourri fashion, no sequence or no order, because as I said, there's no way I can cover the subject in an orderly fashion. What are the definitive indications? Suppose you see a retinal detachment. There are certain cases where you say, no question of buckle, no question of pneumatic retinopexy. I have to do a pars-plana surgery. What would be those indications? Because this is where you will segregate yourself. You are not comfortable with vitreous surgery, you hand it out to the person who is comfortable with it. Okay? These are a posterior retinal break, which you would not like these days. Once upon a time, in the pre-vitrectomy era, we were detaching muscles and buckling all the way up to the macula. But it's not required now. With elegant vitrectomy techniques, we do not do large buckles. In fact, 280 buckle has gone out of fashion. We only use either 276 or 279 at the most. Anything beyond that, you do vitrectomy. So a posterior retinal break, you do vitrectomy. A giant retinal tear, you do vitrectomy, because anything beyond 30 degrees of circumferential extent, the retina tends to fold back or fall back or sag down. So centralmost part of the 30-degree tear will be located much more posteriorly than the two limits of the tear. That's called sagging. So because of the sagging, a buckle which looks adequate to you is not adequate sometimes. So you have to put unnecessarily broad buckle to cover a sagging break. So any break which is more than 30 degrees, which is 1 clock hour, you may sometimes prefer to do a vitrectomy rather than doing a buckle. Giant retinal tear, of course, is beyond 90 degrees. You obviously do a vitrectomy. Any PVR, any degree of PVR, you tend to do a vitrectomy. But there are certain situations like chronic detachments with subretinal gliotic bands, which may sometimes do surprisingly well with just a buckling. Multiple retinal tears in different quadrants, associated vitreous hemorrhage, associated crystalline lens dislocation, associated dislocated IOL, where you tend to manage both problems at the same time, are associated with conditions like colobomas, morning glory syndromes, etc. Those cases also you would like to manage through pars-plana vitrectomy. This slide I will skip because Dr. Ajit Babu already covered what are the indications for pars-plana vitrectomy in diabetic retinopathy. Okay? He mentioned to you about non-resolving vitreous hemorrhage, blah blah blah. I think I'll just add this dense premacular hemorrhage, because they say that the blood in front of the retina, if left for too long a time, can be toxic to the macula, and the recovery of vision may not be too good if you leave it too long a time in contact with the macula. Otherwise, all others have been very well covered, including indications in macular edema. So what are the common complications of scleral buckling? Again, this is a commonly asked question. It's easiest to answer any question if you divide them into 2 or 3 headings. Even if you give one complication for each one of these 3, you have covered the subject reasonably well. The examiner is satisfied with your answers. And interrupt, it's easy to go in a sequential fashion. During surgery, first few days, and long afterwards. Okay? During surgery, there will be problems with the muscle handling. There could be problems with the localization and cryopexy of the retinal breaks because of non-dilating pupil, medial haze. You may damage the vertex space in the process of trying to get at a very posterior break. an improper freezing or wrong areas being frozen because you don't know where you're indenting. You're indenting at the wrong point, or you're looking at a point where you're not indenting. Okay, that is shaft versus tip indentation problem. And again, buckle placement, you can accidentally perforate the globe, and the buckle versus brake relationship may not be appropriate. The brake may not be in the center of the buckle. Drainage complications, you may drain at the wrong site, you may get a dry tap. There could be bleeding into subretinal space, which is a very common, not uncommon complication. Retinal incarceration, choroidal hemorrhage, etc. But the most common complication is fish mouthing, which is a large retinal tear, like a tractional tear, tends to open up like a fish mouth and tends to cause continued leakage and recurrence of detachment, although the brake is physically placed over the buckle. When you see it during surgery, you can correct it by injecting a bubble of gas, or in the worst case scenario, you can do a vitrectomy. In the early postoperative period, there can be persistent retinal detachment. Now, when there is retinal detachment present in the first postoperative, that doesn't mean it's a failure of surgery. It could mean that there may be some fluid left behind during surgery, which will take time to clear, as in a case of a non-drainage procedure or incomplete drainage, or where the brake is not closed in the first day, but it gets closed the second or third day. Or there is a chronic detachment with residual fluid, which may take sometimes even 6 months to clear. Or there is an unidentified additional brake. So you need to be alert to this possibility that there is another brake which you have missed during surgery. Look for it. Or a totally new brake which has occurred, which is relatively uncommon, I would say, more common that you have missed the brake. Choroidal detachment is not uncommon a complication. And you can have secondary glaucoma, which could be gas-induced, steroid-induced, or angle closure, especially when there is a choroidal detachment. The whole iris diaphragm will be pushed forwards. Rarely only you get infections with scleral buckling because most of the procedures are extraocular, barring the SRF drainage. Late postoperatively, you can get recurrent detachments due to new brakes, due to PVR, buccal intrusions, extrusions, migrations are a problem. Buccal infections can occur, double vision because you're handling the extraocular muscles, and you can get induced refractive errors, specifically myopia and astigmatism. These are some of the complications which are easy to list. We should also know about what are the anti-segment indications for vitrectomy. Some of them have been covered already, but just to re-emphasize, subluxed and dislocated lenses are eminently managed from behind rather than trying to struggle from in front and trying to put ECR, and with the ECR the whole capsular bag falls into the vitreous cavity and then you go back fishing the whole thing out. So if it is significantly subluxed from the patellar fossa, best is to hand it out to the VR surgeon to handle it. Same way dislocated and subluxed IOLs. Malignant glaucoma is eminently, very elegantly handled from behind. You go from behind and do a vitrectomy, at least an anterior mid vitrectomy, and create a iridotomy with a communication between the anterior chamber and the vitreous space. Then your malignant glaucoma is totally cured. Dropped nucleus and fragments are also an indication for vitrectomy. In the ocular trauma, situations where you need vitrectomy or vitreous hemorrhage, retinal detachments, dislocated lenses and intraocular lenses, intraocular foreign body, endophthalmitis, and vitreous lens admixture. I just want to underline this. Very often, corneoscleral trauma with lens rupture, and lens vitreous admixture is handled by the first, secondary resident, third resident in the emergency. And what they tend to do is usually less than optimal management. Their whole aim is to suture the corneal wound and not so much worry about the wound toilet. And if you don't do a proper wound toilet, you will have problems later on of anti-segment corneal decompensation, ingrowth, or epithelium, blah, 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 infection, etc. So it's rather important that the first management should be most elegantly done. So what you should do is maybe put 1 or 2 sutures approximate the cornea, then make, if you don't have to go through pars plana if you're not comfortable, it doesn't matter, go through the limbus to separate wounds and use a vitreous cutter to remove all the vitreous lens admixture. There is no way you can clean it well with your sponge vitrectomy. So never think that by sponge vitrectomy you can remove the vitreous. First postoperative you see on slit lamp, you'll see a big sheet in the corneal wound. So if you do a good wound toilet, you'll do a much better job for the patient later on. The wound heals well, less astigmatism, less risk of infection, and you can also correct them for the aphakia later on much better. I said there's no need to go through pars plana for doing this job. You can go through the limbus. What are the internal tamponating agents that you know of? Is another commonly asked question. Okay, got the air, expansile gases, silicon oil, and perfluorocarbon liquids. The air, expansile gas, and silicon oil are used sometimes after surgery as well. But PFCLs are mostly used as an intraoperative tamponating agent and not as a postoperative agent because it tends to emulsify fast and causes a lot of toxic reactions. So what are the uses of perfluorocarbon liquids? These are all heavy liquids which were brought to the ophthalmic use by Stanley Chang, and they have really revolutionized the way we manage many vitreoretinal disorders. The management of giant retinal tear, management of PVR, it acts as a third hand. It holds the retina down when you can peel the membranes. You can displace the subretinal fluid anteriorly, so through anterior retinal break you can drain the fluid. You can displace the subretinal blood anteriorly. When of course it is a liquid form, not the solid clot. You can flotate a dislocated lens or intraocular lens using perfluorocarbon liquid, but don't attempt it for the intraocular foreign body because most foreign bodies are heavier than PFCL, specific gravity wise. It facilitates a measured retinectomy or retinotomy during vitreoretinal surgery to reattach a severely contracted retina. These are some of the uses of perfluorocarbon liquids. The other important point you should know is what macular diseases are amenable these days for surgery. Once upon a time, macular hole, no surgery. Now, every macular hole is being operated. So, there is so much of shift in the way we view various diseases because of the newer technology available for treatment. So, epiretinal membranes, which is in front of the retina. So, remember, this is in front of the retina, this is within the retina, and this is underneath the retina. In front of the retina is epiretinal membranes and vitreomacular traction. Within the retina is a macular hole or a macular schisis, like a highly myopic eye. And underneath the retina is submacular hemorrhage or subretinal cysticercosis, like in India. Okay, these are some of the indications for surgery. Previously, submacular choroidal neovascular used to be operated. Matthew Thomas in St. Louis had a big series, but it all has become outmoded now because of anti-VEGF drugs. What are the prognostic factors? Maybe the last two slides. Prognostic factors for surgery. I'm not talking about the intraoperative techniques and all that. I'm talking about broad indications where you get good result versus poor result. Again, if you know that, even as a general ophthalmologist, you can tell the patient in which case he is likely to get good result after surgery and encourage them to go through the surgery. The duration of macular, that's about macular hole. Duration of macular hole, duration of visual loss, retinal pigmentary epithelial changes in the macular area, the size of the macular hole, etc. These are all factors which influence the recovery of vision following a successful macular hole closure. I think maybe because of time I'll go through the last two slides. Yeah. These are the list of conditions where the prognosis is likely to be good, so you would like to push the patient towards undergoing surgery. Like a fresh detachment of retina, you wouldn't ask him to pickle it and come after 6 months. If he says that my daughter is getting married after 1 month, I'll come only after that, you would not wait for that. Okay? You would push them to undergo surgery very early because earlier you do, better the prognosis. Macular hole surgery is again within 1 year of onset of the macular hole. The success rate is almost 90+%. So you push them to go through surgery because the results are so good. Surgery for epiretinal membrane removal, again, surgery is done within 1 to 1.5 years of onset of ERM and symptomatic ERM. The results are very good. With very low failure rate and very low complication rate. That's why you recommend surgery strongly. Surgery for dislocated lenses, fragments, IOL is again very good success rate because the retina is pristine and healthy, so they get back good vision as long as you don't cause any intraoperative complications. Most indications of vitreous hemorrhage, whether it's Eales disease or traumatic or BRVO or diabetic, as long as there is no TRD and not a sick macula underneath, they get very good result. Again, the results are extremely good with the present day surgical techniques. Bacterial endophthalmitis detected early and needing a vitrectomy, again have a very good result. Unlike fungal endophthalmitis or a bacterial endophthalmitis which was not operated on time. And again, after 1 week or 15 days when the retina is all necrotic, then the results are much worse. An intraocular foreign body which has gone in but did not damage the retina also has very good prognosis if you operate immediately and remove the foreign body. These are some of the very good indications where the surgeon feels happy, the patient also feels happy. But there are also situations where you may feel happy, but the patient is not so happy, because the result from the point of vision is not very good, although you think you have fixed the retina and you have solved the basic problem. These are recurrent detachments with severe PVR. You may operate twice, thrice, 4 times, retinectomy, put in oil, take it out, put it back again, etc. And at the end of the day, you think the retina is attached, but he has only finger counting vision. Large macular holes of long duration, sometimes they don't close at all, or even if they close, the visual recovery is very poor. Diabetic combined detachments with very thin atrophic retina, they do very poorly, because during surgery, a lot of retinal breaks occur, as well as after surgery, they don't seem to recover good vision. Traumatic proliferative retinopathies do very poorly because of the propensity for reproliferation. The recurrence rate is so high with traumatic PVRs because of the admixture of the antigens introduced into the eye during the injury, along with the scleral dehiscence, which introduces a lot of other factors inside the eye. And blood also mixes with it. That causes the traumatic PVR to be very severe, unlike the regular RD-related PVR. Morning glory syndrome related retinal detachments do very, very poorly, because one, we don't know the origin of these detachments, and you fix it, they seem to come back again, because many people believe the origin is from the cerebrospinal fluid, and to fix the retina around the optic disc, even doing a laser, we don't know exactly whether it works properly or not. Fungal endophthalmitis does very poorly, not because your surgery is bad, but because we don't have effective drugs against fungus, unlike against bacteria. We don't have fungicidal drugs. Most of the drugs we have are fungistatic. So you require very good body immunity, very good debulking for the antifungal drug to totally cure the disease. Very often you end up with having a temporary control, only to have a granuloma coming back after some time. Even in this, you got acute fulminant fungal endophthalmitis. They sometimes do very well, because the fungus is multiplying as rapidly like a bacterium, and hence is more susceptible to the drugs to get eliminated, unlike a chronic granuloma which has occurred 3 months after surgery, 4 months after surgery. You never eradicate the disease. Very often you end up with evisceration after 1 year or 2 years. Again, CMV retinitis is a very bad condition to operate upon, where you tend to stabilize the eye for some time to come, and very often you don't get very good results because the macula is damaged by the CMV retinitis. Having said that, say CMV retinitis associated with non-HIV related conditions, like somebody who has a lymphoma or some other temporary immunosuppressive disorder from which they have recovered because of bone marrow transplant, etc., they seem to do very well once you do fix the retina back. But HIV related retinopathy is, you can give them temporary vision for some time, but very often the CMV retinitis can come back unless they are on constant antiretroviral treatment. Thank you very much for your attention.